Greetings all, and welcome to our event, which is the third event in our series, which is broadly on crisis, uncertainty, and history, trajectories, and experiences of accelerated change. Our topic today is climate change, crisis, and resilience in the pre-modern world. I'm John Brook. I'm the director of the Ohio State Center for Historical Research. And our seminar today brings together Geoffrey Parker, locally from Ohio State University, and Adam Izdebski, coming to us from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. My colleague, Professor Tina Sessa, will make a fuller and more formal introduction, but I want to thank Adam in particular for his willingness to sacrifice his Friday night evening to join us. It's now 7:30 in Central European time. He and Geoffrey have just had a warm-up with our students in the graduate colloquium, and they are either energized or exhausted. I think we actually had a great time. So, but let me take a few minutes for a few formalities before Tina makes her introductions. First, we are a big group in a Zoom session, so I hope you could mute yourself and turn off your videos for the moment. In a little more than an hour or so, we'll be opening up for audience participation, and you can reemerge. Tina and I will monitor the chat function and either pose questions directly from the chat or ask you to make your own questions pop out from behind the wall. And if you have any specific things, procedural, et cetera, that you want to inquire about, please send me or Tina a private note in the chat. Second, as director of the CHR, I want to thank a lot of people for making this series possible, and particularly many thanks to the steering committee of the crisis series for unfailing attention to the big picture and to the detail of our ongoing project. My co-host Laura Seeger of the Goldberg Technology Center keeps things running smoothly behind the scenes. Chris Adams and Steve McCann, department fiscal officers, make sure our finances are in order. And among our co-sponsors, I want to thank our department chair, Scott Levi, for his ongoing and unfailing support of the center's activities. Finally, I'd like to make a pitch for next semester's events. In January and February, Michael Berry, Jacob Saul, and Julia Kablinska will be speaking on disinformation, accounting, and media in the wider framework of crisis. But if I might, given the particular interests of a significant group in our audience, I will highlight our April 8th event, when Joe Manning will be speaking here on his new work, Climate and Society from Egypt to India to China, a regional crisis at 160 BCE question mark. And he might even be in the audience. You know, he's registered. So once again, thanks everybody for joining us today. And Tina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And I just want to start off by saying how excited I am to be presenting an introduction to a session that will feature two scholars who not only work on environmental crisis and history, which is of late a deep interest of mine, but also who work on the pre-modern world, which is an unusual event, sadly, in the world of history, but I'm excited nonetheless. Let me start. I'm going to start my introduction. I have two fabulous people to introduce you to, and I'm going to start with Geoffrey Parker, who, of course, is my colleague here at OSU. When one asks Geoffrey Parker for a copy of his CV, one is actually sent two documents, one of which is labeled really short bio. Now, at first I thought this was a little bit silly. I mean, surely one could swiftly and easily compile a thumbnail sketch of Geoffrey's career. But then I opened this CV and it's 47 pages long, single space. So alas, thank you, Geoffrey. Let me start with the really short bio that Professor Parker kindly provided. Geoffrey Parker has taught at Cambridge and St. Andrews Universities in the UK, at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and at Illinois and Yale in the US, before becoming the Andreas Dorpalen Professor of European History at the Ohio State University. He has directed 35 doctoral dissertations to completion, as well as publishing 40 books, 40 books, and over 100 articles on military history, global environmental history, and early modern Europe. His work has been translated into many languages, including Dutch. In 2012, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences awarded him the Heineken Prize for History. So this is what Geoffrey would highlight about himself. And I think even with this understated short bio, really short bio, we still get the sense of the truth, which is that Geoffrey is among the most eminent and important living historians of early modern Europe. And also, I will say that introducing him is a real challenge. So to keep this relatively brief, I won't discuss his extensive research and publications on military history, many of which have been groundbreaking and have essentially set the scholarly baseline. And here I'm thinking of his much lauded and still influential The Military Revolution. Nor will I list the dozens of awards that he has received, both for individual projects and for lifetime scholarly achievement, which include, but are not limited to, a Guggenheim, an NEH, a British Academy Medal, and my personal favorites, induction into not one, but two Spanish knighthoods for his work on Philip II and Charles V. Let me instead say a few words about the book that brings him to our series. And that book, of course, is Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century. And this was published by Yale back in 2013. Global Crisis invites us to consider the supporting role of climate change in the history of the 17th century, an era famously branded, I think, by Hugh Trevor Roper as the general crisis, in light of the dozens of revolts, wars, economic problems, and political upheavals that shook and in some cases toppled states in Europe, Asia, and Africa. And by the way, Geoffrey kindly lists these events in a handy-dandy AHR roundtable on crisis and the 17th century, published back in 2008. So if you want a list of them all, there you have it. What Parker argues in Global Crisis is that we can only truly appreciate this general crisis by looking at the interrelationships of humans with their environment, which in the 17th century meant decades of unusually cold summers, exceptional winter freezes, and unstable precipitation. This was a century of both flooding and drought. This is what is otherwise known as the Little Ice Age. This era of climatic cooling and instability, he finds, brought wide-scale resource scarcity, which synergistically intersected with various forms of economic and social vulnerabilities, which in turn triggered a range of political, military, and social crises across the globe. And I apologize for that sentence with all of the clauses kind of packed on one another, but this is indeed a quite complex model of causality, and I wanted to make sure I gave that some voice here. The book, in other words, forces us to consider how climate change, especially changes potentially linked to chaotic short-term weather patterns, might have contributed to very human historical outcomes which, as he shows, were differentially experienced across space and time. And I'll just note in brief that among the various kind of virtues and points of influence of this book are the fact that Geoffrey uses quite a bit of paleoscientific data, which has not been something until fairly recently historians have been comfortable with using. That is, data produced by natural scientists. And then the other sort of point of note about the book is that it also makes a real effort to appeal to policymakers. And in fact, because of this, I think he was asked quite recently to submit a short piece on the book for politicians at COP2 in Glasgow. So I hope that gives you a sense of Geoffrey Parker as a scholar, and in particular, his contributions to these questions about environmental change, Crisis in History. Now let me introduce our second speaker, Adam Izdebski. So Adam did not send me a really short bio, but if I'm being honest, I wish he had, for his CV is also long, distinguished, multifaceted, and hence hard to summarize. Professor Izdebski currently teaches at, I'm going to butcher this because it's a Polish word that I've never been quite sure how to pronounce, but Jagiellonian University in Krakow, you can correct me later, where he is an associate professor of history. His early training at the universities of Warsaw and Oxford was primarily in the social, economic, and religious history of late antiquity and the Byzantine Empire. And he has published on topics like episcopal authority in late antique Italy, as well as Christianity in the Sassanid Persian Empire. However, lest one think that Professor Izdebski is just yet another historian, let me point out a few other highlights of his resume. First, in addition to several graduate degrees and a 2020 habilitation in history, Professor Izdebski holds an MA in psychology and psychometric analysis. And were we meeting in person, there would be, I think, many, many questions to ask over wine about this intriguing pivot. But alas, we're on Zoom, and I'll simply say that I assume this is where he learned how to become familiar and perhaps comfortable with numbers and statistics, which is not something that is common among historians, at least those of us trained in the last half century. Moreover, while Professor Izdebski may self-identify as a Byzantinist, he in fact works at the cutting edge of pre-modern environmental studies. In addition to his teaching position in Krakow, Adam is part of an interdisciplinary research team at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany. There he is involved in two separate research projects. The first explores the possibilities of integrating paleoscientific and historical research, the methodological challenges of which he is also published on extensively. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And I note that Professor Izdebski is the PI on this project, which has been awarded nearly 2 million euros in funding. Impressive, to say the least. The second project, Scales of Fragmentation, explores bioarchaeological evidence of economic and social transformation from late Roman to the early medieval period in the Eastern Mediterranean. This project, I presume, relates to his recent dive into palynological evidence, that is the use of fossilized pollen remains as a proxy for reconstructing landscape change, foodways, and even demographic developments, as his forthcoming essay in Nature Portfolio on big data paleoecology and the Black Death shows. More importantly, he's the author, or more broadly, I should say, he is the author of 2 monographs and at least a dozen articles, many of which appear in scientific journals, as well as in distinguished historical journals like Annals and the Journal of Interdisciplinary History. He also co-edited the first wide-scale collection of essays on late antique environmental history, environment and society in the long late antiquity, published in 2018. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that Adam has also edited an eco-biography of his own city, Krakow. What I most appreciate about Adam's scholarship is his willingness to grapple with the theoretical implications and problems of bringing scientific data and methods into conversation with historical data and methods, and the ways in which studying pre-modern peoples and environments presents additional layers of complexity to the enterprise. And I know he'll be speaking quite a bit today to us on some of these challenges. His forthcoming Annals essay in particular, which, like so much of his work, is co-authored with natural scientists and historians, really speaks to the possibilities of thinking about history with science and vice versa. And with this, I will end and hand over the conversation to our 2 participants. And I'd like to start by handing first the baton over to you, Adam, because you, I believe, are going to begin the conversation. So thank you. Thank you, both you and Geoffrey, for being here today.
Yes, thank you very much for such a nice introduction, and I hope I will fulfill the expectations based on this introduction. The students who participated in the seminar before our current meeting, they know why I studied psychology, so perhaps you can ask one of them, and I will leave it for now. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited to have this dual presentation and discussion afterwards, and I will move on to the talk right now. Okay, and now the slideshow. Yes, so as I understood the idea of our meeting today, and this is something we already discussed this week when we met in a small group, is to share some reflections and perspectives on climate and crisis. And I thought the most interesting thing to do for me would be to share a perspective coming from these different theoretical attempts at integrating the natural, scientific, and historical evidence in the study of historical societies. I would probably say pre-industrial. I'm working more and more with early modern historians, although still I feel most at home in ancient history. So this is really a perspective coming from different periods of the late Holocene. And as a kind of bon mot, or let's say very short summary of what I'm going to discuss is this question, impact or outcomes. And this is perhaps, this will become clear in the next 3-5 minutes when I present two possible theoretical approaches to climate and crisis in pre-industrial societies. So just to explain what I will do, there will first be this very brief basic concepts introduction, then 3 case studies going from the times of Tina to the times of Geoffrey, so from late antiquity to the 17th century through the late medieval times as the middle case study. And this will go from methodological considerations, which will be very clear, of course, in the basic concepts, but also in the first 2 case studies, to questions of how what we do can be relevant for policy making and policy questions. So you will see that as we move on, these case studies will be framed differently. And I hope this will also be a good lead into what Geoffrey has to say today. So now let us move on to the basic concepts. To an extent, the field of climate history has been developing about around the concept of impacts. So, which is completely understandable when 2 disciplines come together, they study 2 phenomena, we are trying to look at the connections between them. And this is where the notion of impacts becomes central. What you see here is, I would say, one of the core diagrams of climate history by Christian Pfister, among others. He republished it and translated into English with subsequent, let's say, spheres of impact of climatic phenomena. You have them at the top, you have the climate, and then you have something that in one of his publications he would call primary, secondary, tertiary, and then you would actually have 4th order, so to say, impacts, which would be in the sphere of culture, religion, and so on. So there is some idea here, as you see, that we have these physical phenomena and they cause changes, they impact the biophysical world, so the ecosystems, including the agro-ecosystems. So this is where agriculture becomes absolutely crucial in this scheme. Then through agriculture, it has economic impacts. So it kind of spreads out to other spheres of human activity. Finally, to demography and the functioning of the society. And here it comes to being conceptualized, worked upon by the culture of the time. And we have the cultural impacts. This whole chain of impacts can be stopped or absorbed or buffered at different, or adapted to at different levels, but we are really thinking of some kind of externality impacting and then a series of impacts going through the life of the society, through the society basically. And this, of course, is a very important model which shows where are the possible connections between climatic phenomena and the society up to cultural processes, cultural phenomena. However, there are other ways of looking at that. And I personally think that they are very useful when we try to integrate different types of evidence coming from both history and the natural sciences. And by that, I mean not only referring to the paleoclimate evidence as some kind of golden standard of knowledge about climate in the past, but also using all the different types of the natural scientific evidence to shed light on on a variety of aspects, on many different aspects of the functioning of past societies and the environments in which they existed. So we are not only talking about connecting one natural science, one branch of the natural sciences with history, but actually bringing a number of them together, and also different branches, subdisciplines of history, also archaeology and so on. And this is where I think the concept of outcomes might be useful, or actually systems or networks thinking. So the situation, exactly, the word situation is what I wanted to use. So not thinking about a chain of reactions, but actually thinking about a situation in which something changes, in which somebody or something takes action, and the entire configuration transforms, and we have some outcome of the situation. And the systems networks thinking can be related to two important theories, or let's say ways of theoretical thinking in social and and environmental science. One of them is the theory of social ecological systems and the resilience theory. And here you have such major concepts as systems and subsystems. So you can multiply that into infinity in a way to think about small systems that create bigger ones and yet bigger ones and so on. And they function together, they act on each other and so on. The very important concept of tipping points. So moments when the change is so big that the state of the system and the identity of the system changes in a way that is not reversible. This is exactly what we fear with the climate system in the 21st century, and why we want to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees to avoid this kind of situation of what would be irreversible damage. And then this is where really fits the concept of resilience, which is about the system continuing to function, keeping its identity despite some shock, despite some disturbance happening, some challenge happening to the system, and it's losing its function, losing its identity would probably be what historians and archaeologists describe as collapse. So this is where we would locate the notion of resilience. This is part of a broader package, actually. And there is another way of systems or networks thinking. This is the actor network theory of Bruno Latour and many other social scientists working mainly on science and technology studies. And this is very interesting for historians, because this is a way of solving the question of how to attribute agency to the nature, how to go beyond the human activity in terms of saying and attributing agency in history. And what this theory says, what it proposes, is to see a whole network, hybrid network of humans and non-humans. So this could be the sun and its energy coming to the earth. This could be volcanoes and so on. So the whole network, the connections between them, they become actors. So we have some kind of networked agency where the activity of humans and non-humans is blurred together. Is hybridized, one could say, in a way. And this is another very important notion, is intermediaries versus mediators. So participants, elements of the network who constantly do the same and somehow transport let's say, the change and the energy, the action, and those who mediate, who transform the way things are being done. And this is really where agency occurs. So I also find it very useful in terms of thinking how the social ecological systems have agency in history. Hybridity is something I already mentioned. This connects to the subsystems that could be natural, social, or actually social ecological. And what also this theory points out is that they are material and semiotic. So we have the natural, the very physical and cultural aspect at the same time. So I will now, yes, what I want to show is an attempt at conceptualizing a historical social ecological system and its source base. So the whole network where this agency that actor network theory talks about could actually occur. And I want to show it because it actually illustrates the added value of the systems or network thinking when you want to bring together all these different types of evidence. So we have here, I try to single out the core of the social ecological system, economic processes, settlement, human presence in the landscape, pathogens, ecosystems, this kind of interface between society and the environment, and the different types of data, both from the humanistic side and from the natural science side, that we can use to reconstruct them and to try to get an idea of how the entire system functioned. So this is just to illustrate how these, how the system thinking can be actually very useful in this difficult situation of having different disciplines contributing a lot of data of their own with their own methodologies, and we need to bring that together into some integrated narrative about the past. And now let us move on to the case studies and show how these concepts could work in practice. So the first one is about latent Italy, more precisely the 6th century in central and northern Italy. And it will be about winter rainfall and religious narratives. And the situation is very interesting because we actually looked very closely with a larger team of historians. I think one of them, Kevin Bloomfield, is present in the audience, and we didn't find any primary or tertiary impacts in the Pfisterian model, but actually we found cultural impacts or outcomes of this situation. So very briefly, there is a speleothem from a cave in Tuscany near Pisa that has been studied by a wonderful group of Italian geologists led by Gianni Zanchetta, and used for reconstructing winter rainfall in northern Italy. So this is this reconstruction, and you can see, just notice that the age axis is reversed on this figure. And the first three parts of this figure have to do with the dating, and the bottom one is about climate. We see the confidence intervals. This is actually, I think, a very good figure to illustrate the problems of uncertainty. And there is also like the possible ranges of this very significant peak in winter rainfall, which occurred at the end of the 6th century, plus minus some 50, 60 years. So, and you can see this is not only one sample, this was a whole process of rainfall intensification, one could say, and then decline to more normal conditions for this part of Europe. And so this is the peak that we are interested in. And as I said, what we saw was actually cultural impacts, cultural outcomes of this situation. So in the hagiography that was composed in Italy at the end of the 6th century, we have a new type of miracles, water miracles that appear in larger numbers than anywhere before in late antiquity. We compare it with other parts of the Mediterranean, thanks to a huge database on the cult of saints. And we really come to the conclusion that something special is happening in the hagiographical writings from Italy at the time. And this is a figure that tries to make sense of that and show how this increased precipitation, this climatic phenomenon, becomes embedded in a whole network of social cultural processes taking place in Italy at that time. So the hydroclimatic stress is perceived through the war damage from recent wars in Italy. There is crisis of old elites and this hydroclimatic stress could be seen as a leadership challenge, even if it didn't lead to a lot of damage. And then there is this Christian worldview that is being promoted and is becoming dominant in this society, and the performance of miracles is the way of relating to what is happening in the natural environment. So this is not an obvious outcome. 100 years earlier or 200 years earlier, we might have observed something different if the same climatic phenomenon happened. So what it illustrates is that the outcome of some change in climatic conditions really depends on how it is integrated into a much broader network, social cultural network in this case, which bestows agency, very concrete cultural agency on this climatic phenomenon. Let us move on to the second case study about the Black Death in Europe, the paper that Tina mentioned earlier. And here I am showing an example of how systems thinking as a way of integrating different types of evidence can be a tool to bring in new sources to revisit old questions. So this is a scheme that shows from the left to the right. First, we have the plague coming to a rural population. We can have high or low mortality, and this leads to a certain landscape change. Landscape could become wild again, or fields turn into pastures if there is high mortality, or if there is no mortality or low mortality, there wouldn't be much change. And all these different landscapes, they produce pollen, so there's signature that is preserved in sediments and wetlands and lakes, and we can study it and kind of do a reversal process of understanding from the landscape change what kind of mortality we would expect in different parts of Europe. And we did a study of 261 such locations, lakes and peatlands across Europe from 19 countries. So we would love to have more data, and you see big gaps, spatial gaps in our data. And this is more or less what we came across. So there were definitely regions like Scandinavia, Central Italy, Greece, where there was very high mortality, which transformed the landscapes, brought these socio-ecological systems beyond some tipping point, whereas there were also parts of Europe where nothing like that could be seen in the landscape. So this is how the systems or network thinking brings us to the point when we are able to use natural scientific evidence to answer questions that are very interesting to, let's say, traditional historians. And now let us move to a third example before we move to the topics of policy. So I mentioned in the abstract some mathematics and machine learning. So this is another application of the systems thinking, a tool in machine learning that we are developing in our institute in Vienna with Ricardo Fernandez, a physicist and an archaeologist. This study that I'm showing you, it focuses on a very specific lake in northern Macedonia, as you can see on the map, during the Ottoman times, so the early modern period. For this lake, we have detailed information on cultivation around it, and we have data on how the ecosystems in this small catchment area of, let's say, plus minus 10 kilometers from the lake change over time. And what we wanted to understand was how different external, possibly external factors, how they shape this small social ecological system. So we looked at prices, we looked at climate, we looked at epidemics, wars, and so on. And just to give you an example of how the result of this entire experiment, which is still going on, this is not definite result. What we are doing here, we are estimating cereal pollen concentration. So the scale of cereal cultivation around this lake during the period of 1500 to 1800, using this big number of independent variables: climate, epidemics, prices, population in Salonika, the nearest big city, and so on and so on. And the machine learning tool is actually trying to create a formula that best predicts the dependent variables, so the changes in cereal pollen cultivation around Lake Doiran. And what is very interesting, we see that the strongest factor impacting on that, or let's say predicting what is going on, is the interaction of the population of Salonika and Ottoman fiscal efficiency. Something to explore, why It is the interaction and not each of these variables on their own, and why there is additional effect of some kind of transition that must occur if we take the Ottoman fiscal, because the machine learning tool suggests that there is also additional impact of the Ottoman fiscal efficiency when it is squared. And then there is another combination of variables, of phenomena that make it possible to predict cereal cultivation. This is the interaction of wheat price in the Mediterranean, first in Italy, and then when we get data in Istanbul from Istanbul, and the spring precipitation, again squared. So we have some effect that becomes stronger when there is when this precipitation anomaly is passing a certain threshold. So this is just to show you that, again, the systems thinking can bring in new tools that are much more mathematical into the historical study. And now the link to policy, which I will present using the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So we are going, again, we are already with Dorpalen in the early modern period, and now we are in the 17th century. We have this huge empire Commonwealth in the center and east of Europe, which collapses at the end of the 18th century and disappears completely. It is really discontinued. And there are two, I would say, policy takeaways from this case study when we think about it in a systems way. First is that resilience is not a constant property of a social system, it's a dynamic process. And the second one is that resilience is not necessarily identical with development and complexity. It may draw on a wide variety of resources. To explain more about resilience as a dynamic process, Poland, Lithuania had its golden age actually during the Little Ice Age. It flourished for 200 years up to 1650s, despite recurring climate extremes and epidemic waves. It was very heavily invaded and politically unstable after 1650 CE. And then when it was confronted with the same environmental stressors, it could not recover and cope with them anymore. Of course, it remains to be studied, and it's a joint project that we are running for several years with Piotr Guzowski, him as the main PI, how these environmental factors really played out in the collapse of the Commonwealth. But there is apparently this very big turning point and the loss of resilience. And this is one of the studies that we've made with geologists from Poznań, where you can see very clearly a drop in cultivation and increase at the left in pine, exactly around the time of the Swedish invasion of Poland in the 1950s. Sorry, I have to move on. We can come back to that in the questions. And the question of resilience versus development, probably the resilience to a big extent came from the bad grains that were preferred in the Commonwealth, less attractive culturally and economically, yet adapted to the difficult climate conditions and poorer soils. And also, very interestingly, the Commonwealth was a very weak state with limited fiscal pressure, inefficient decision processes, which actually reduced social tensions, and adapted state demands to productive capacity. So they were the way for the system to keep functioning until a certain point in time. And I think there are actually some policy lessons that could be drawn from that. There is no single general resilience recipe for all EU countries. And resilience is not really given once and forever. This really needs maintenance. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. That was fascinating and lots of helpful and interesting and intriguing points to draw on. At this point, I'm going to hand this over now to you, Geoffrey. Are you ready to go?
If you can see my screen, Tina, I am ready to go.
You are all set, sir. Take it away.
Okay. I am going to follow up on Adam, who ended with the 17th century, where I spend most of my life these days. The presentation I have for you is in 4 parts. There'll be a little bit of history. I want to mention the 2 archives for the study of climate, but with particular reference to the human archive. Say a little bit about how to turn a crisis into a catastrophe, and then to offer a formula for resilience. So first of all, a little bit of history. I mean, okay, it's my history, but this is my presentation. So I remember as if it were yesterday, the moment when I became interested in the global crisis of the 17th century. It was one evening in 1976 when I listened to an interview on the BBC Third programme. That's radio. Some of you, the older ones, will remember radio. And this was an interview with Jack Eddy, a solar physicist. And he just published a paper in Science on what he called the Maunder minimum, the period between 1645 and 1715, when virtually no sunspots appeared. And he speculated that the prolonged sunspot minimum noted by contemporary astronomers during, ironically, the reign of the Sun King, Louis XIV, 1643 to 1715. Yeah, it was a bad joke in 1976. It's still a bad joke, but hey. This sunspot minimum contributed to an episode of global cooling that Earth scientists had christened the Little Ice Age. This is one of Jack's own slides, and he noted a distinction that I think is critical for historians of any period and any topic, the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. And what he was able to show was evidence of absence, because following Galileo's discovery of or manufacture of telescopes, Galileo made them and gave them as gifts to lots of other people. You have a large number of astronomers looking at the sun, trying to find sunspots. In fact, there are 8,000 days of observations. But in the 70 years, 1645 to 1715, in those 70 years, the astronomers looked and looked, but only saw 100 sunspots. That's fewer than appear in a single year at the present. And it suggested a marked reduction in solar energy received on Earth, therefore contributing towards an episode of global cooling. And Eddy wondered whether this prolonged episode of global cooling might have contributed to the political upheavals of the day, something, as Tina pointed out, that historians of Europe had already begun to call the general crisis. Now, I found that parallel, that connection, so interesting that I decided to edit some essays on the general crisis, together with one of my former doctoral advisees, Leslie Smith, and we requested and received Eddy's permission to include his essay in our volume, published in 1978. And I think that was the first application of solar physics to early modern history. Since then, there have been many other studies, and they have shown that there were other connections between earth sciences and human affairs. This graph here comes from our colleagues at the Bird Polar Research Center, and I thank Lonnie Thompson for providing it. And it shows major aberrations in the frequency of El Nino, ENSO, in the 1350s, so precisely the period of the Black Death that Adam mentioned, and also in the 1790s, which of course is the period of revolution in Europe and in China. The aberration in El Nino is less pronounced in around the mid-17th century, particularly less pronounced in the southern hemisphere. This is south, this is north. But nevertheless, there were twice as many El Nino events in the mid-17th century as there are now. Earth scientists also found that volcanic activity, which likewise leads to global cooling, peaked in the mid-17th century, with some massive eruptions in equatorial regions, creating dust clouds over precisely those areas of the globe that are home to the densest populations, and also precisely those areas of the globe that saw a concentration of wars and revolutions, from China over here to Britain, with Charles I being executed by his subjects in London, but he's King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and he dies in 1649. I spent the next 35 years seeking connections between these natural and human events. And what did I find? Well, first of all, I found that my original title wouldn't work. I was planning to call the book The World Crisis. That's, Tina very kindly mentioned that I got a Guggenheim and it was on this project, and it was entitled The World Crisis. But a former doctoral advisee, another former doctoral advisee, cruelly reminded me that it had already been used by Winston Churchill for his history of World War I. And when I said, well, no one will really notice, she reminded me that A.J. Balfour, one of Churchill's political enemies, had waspishly dismissed the world crisis as Winston's brilliant autobiography disguised as a history of the universe. So, global crisis, I had to change. I would like to share now two takeaways from the study which I eventually produced after 35 years in 2013. First of all, I think there is a fatal synergy between climate change and human inflexibility. And in the mid-17th century, it eradicates 1/3 of the planet's human population and also unleashes an unparalleled spate of wars, invasions, and revolutions. A combination of personal accounts and scientific data shows how extreme weather disrupted growing seasons and destroyed harvests, bringing hunger, malnutrition, forced migration, and disease. And then, as material conditions worsened, it brought economic chaos, political anarchy, and social collapse. Adam dealt brilliantly with the scientific data. I would like to offer in a couple of moments an example of the human archive, showing these different stages and the links between them, the fatal synergy between climate change and human catastrophe. So that was the first takeaway, that there is a connection. I rather like this cover, by the way. There is Masaniello, leader of the Naples uprising of 1647. He's a fisherman, therefore he has a very loud voice, and he can address the gathering around him. There he is with his fisherman's red bonnet and his white shirt as his followers stab a nobleman to death. It's painted a couple of years afterwards. It's one of the first examples of political art from the 1640s. So the second takeaway is that Japan, it seems to me, adopted a series of measures which get it off the hook. It suffers the same episodes of extreme weather as the rest of the globe in the early 1640s. It kills 500,000 people, and it convinces the rulers, the Tokugawa shoguns, that they need to do something about it. So on the one hand, they create more granaries, they upgrade communications infrastructure, and they avoid foreign wars, specifically in order to accumulate sufficient food reserves to cope with future disasters. They also, and I should warn you that the next slide is rather disturbing, they also promote infanticide. Infanticide becomes the commonest single response to short-run economic adversity in the 17th century, because infanticide is the quickest way to bring supply and demand for food into equilibrium on a family level. What you see here is a midwife kneeling over a newly born child. Of course, it's a girl. And the parents are busy discussing whether she should kill it or save it. And the Japanese word, and again, you know, this is not pleasant, mabiki, which is the word that's used when you get a rice, when the rice begins to shoot. You have to thin out the rows of rice so that the ones that are healthier will thrive and the rest are plucked out and cast away. And the Japanese word for infanticide is mabiki. How I wish Fabian Drixler had published his amazing book of that title in time for me to use it in the global crisis. But that's one of the problems of writing global history. Material appears in print or in databases faster than any scholar can read it. So I turn to my second topic. That's my bit of history. I turn to my second topic, which is a question of evidence. I think there are two archives that allow us to study climate change in history. One of them is the Natural Archive, climatic proxy data such as ice cores, glacier advances, pollen deposits, and above all tree ring size, which Adam talked about so eloquently. The second, which will be my topic now, is the Human Archive, chronicles, weather diaries, numerical information such as harvest dates, which change every year, art, archaeology, and even violins. This is an Antonio Stradivari violin using spruce trees, a spruce tree that grew to maturity in the mid to late 17th century. And musicologists have found recently that the trees used by Stradivari have extraordinarily dense tree rings. To be precise, his trees laid down 220 rings per inch instead of the normal 90 to 150. And although one must not underestimate the genius of that remarkable craftsman, a violin made of unusually dense wood with thicker cell walls will resonate better. There's no argument about the unique narrowness of the rings in the trees that Stradivari used to make his instruments, thanks to the Little Ice Age. Written sources come in many forms, and one of the best collections, indeed, I'll go further, the best collection that I know, is in this book here, Desastres Agrícolas en Mexico. I don't really need to translate that, do I? Agricultural Disasters in Mexico. This is volume 1, which goes from 958 to 1822. This is volume 1, published in 2004, and it prints all the known material from the Human Archive, grouped in annual entries. There's a full transcript of every known written source on carestía, shortage, hambre, hunger, falta de lluvias, lack of rain, that afflicted the Valley of Mexico. And it's arranged year by year. And among other things, it showed 5 years of drought between 1639 and 1643, during which the price of the price of corn quintupled, leaving the granaries without food and the citizens without water. So mortalities increase. So there's quite a good case of climate change, short-term climate change, leading to major human consequences. So the two archives, a division between human and natural sources is not new. In 1959, the British scientist C.P. Snow, also novelist C.P. Snow, lamented the divergence of what he called the two cultures, science and the humanities. And the divergence between those two has increased exponentially with the development of computers and supercomputers to crunch the scientific data. But historians can use computers and this wonderful new technology on the human archive as well to produce a new narrative and analytical account. And permit me to offer, you could always turn off, but I'm going to offer one example anyway. A single example, the 1641 depositions. 20,000 manuscript papers held in the library of Trinity College, Dublin, in the wake of a massive rebellion in Ireland in October 1641, following 3 disastrous harvests in a row. And the rebellion is of the Catholics against the Protestants, the Catholic majority against the Protestant minority. There's lots of propaganda appearing soon afterwards as gangs of Catholics on the left here pursue Protestants, stripping them naked and sending them out in the frost and snow, whereof many hundreds are perished to death, and many are lying dead in the ditches, and savages, that's the Catholics, upbraided them, saying, "Now are ye wild Irish as well as we." So that's one form of revenge propaganda, because it is, of course, intended to excite Protestant revenge. But other Protestants went about it in a different way, and that's where we get to the depositions. A team of judges, all Protestants, took down sworn depositions from over 2,000 Protestant men and over 600 Protestant women, narrating the things that they had seen and heard and suffered in the autumn of 1641. And in the end, they generate almost 20,000 pages of first-person testimony, explicitly recorded, to document the atrocities and thus create a dossier that could later be used against the Catholic perpetrators. Not for nothing were these books known as the Books of Discrimination. The source has been available for over 200 years, but not many in the library of TCD, but not many people used it until 2010, when a team of experts made available on the web scans and transcripts of all 20,000 pages. And transcripts. I'm going to show you a transcript in just a moment. They also published them in 12 volumes. Okay, they got €1 million from the European Union to do this, but that's €1 million really well spent. Since all the depositions are machine readable, you can in fact type snow frost into 1641.tcd.ie, and immediately you will bring up entries. I counted 65 just with those 2 words. Inevitably, it includes a deponent called Snow and a witness called Frost, but the rest of the entries and others found by typing in things like cold are explicit about the role of extreme cold in killing Irish Protestants in October 1641. Please remember, Ireland is a country that very rarely sees frost and snow, and I've never heard of it occurring in October. Consider, however, the testimony. This is, again, upsetting. This is a transcript of Thomas Richardson of Newry in the county of Down, a sailor and an English Protestant, taken on the 13th of June, 1642, so 9 months after his lucky escape from his house. This is the transcript. It says exactly what the document says, even to the crossings out. And it describes how he, his wife, and his 5 children were stripped of all their clothes, flying away for safety, naked in the frost. One poor daughter of his, seeing him and his mother grieve for their general misery, said she wasn't cold, nor would she cry, but then she died of cold and want. And the first night, this deponent and his wife, creeping for shelter into a poor crate cabin, were glad to lie upon their children to keep in them heat and save them alive. If you take it together, the search function of 1641.tcd.ie enables us to state that more deponents recorded deaths from snow and frost and extreme cold than from violence. Translated into general terms, that means that the Little Ice Age at least doubled, and probably more than doubled, the number of Protestants who met an unnatural death that autumn. We can also run another check on this data. Survivors of 1641 said at the time that the winter was more bitter than was of some years before or since seen in Ireland. Now, I hardly remind you that the world is full of people who say, this is the worst winter we have ever seen. The conditions are really terrible, unprecedented ferocity. But this time we know they're right because the scientists have come up with these figures. 1641 is indeed the coldest summer in the past 6 centuries, the coldest summer recorded in the past 6 centuries, etc., etc. That's when the grain ripens, or in this case doesn't ripen. It also shows that it's one of the coldest winters recorded in the 17th century. The Irish Protestants were thus doubly unlucky. They had neighbours who turned on them at a time when frost and snow, which the insurgents could not have realised, kills far more than they do. That's why so many thousands of them perish. Why do I go on about this? Because it's a live issue today. It resonates today. The Protestants, led by Oliver Cromwell, did indeed exact their revenge on the Irish Catholics, leading to a Protestant ascendancy that lasted until the partition of Ireland in 1921, that fueled the troubles in Northern Ireland in the later 20th century, and which lie behind the controversy even today, even as I speak, over implementing Brexit in the island of Ireland. Look at this mural. There is Oliver himself, the Lord Protector, defender of the Protestant faith. And here is a Catholic about to be stabbed to death by Cromwell's troopers. And it's the end of a building, you know. It's a mural on the end of a building. There's the rest of the buildings over here. It's, of course, from a Protestant area. It's from the Shonkill Road in West Belfast, photographed on the 6th of April, 2011. So, there is my human archive. It's one of the most difficult things, ladies and gentlemen, to fit together a climatic event and the human consequences. It's important not to draw bullseyes around the bullet holes. But here we have a climatic shift, a severe climatic event, and we can see the consequences. And it just happens in this case, the consequences have gone down right to the today. So, part 3 of the presentation, how do you turn a crisis like that into a catastrophe? Well, the Irish example shows how humans can turn a climate-driven crisis into a catastrophe. Our ordinary human beings, in this case ordinary Catholics, can do that. Governments can do it too. Or as the good people of Glasgow say, crossing the street to pick a fight. A gratuitous act of malevolence that turns something bad and often minor into a major disaster. And here the example I want to give you is the Manchu conquest of Ming China, starting in 1644. One of first of all, the Manchu come in, they take over Beijing, they take over northern China, basically the Yellow River. And then they decide that all their male subjects should dress like them, and above all, that they should shave their foreheads and wear the rest in a pigtail. You can see this being done on the left-hand side of the picture. Now, that's just like them. The Manchu also have their foreheads shaved and they wear their hair in a pigtail. It's very clever as a test of loyalty because men have to keep their foreheads shaved. And so it's a constant test that you are a Manchu loyalist. And all who refuse to follow the instructions are treated as enemies. In the cruel saying of the time, lose your hair and keep your head. Keep your hair and lose your head. And this policy of tonsorial castration, implemented after the Manchus had already displaced the Ming in North China, proved hugely unpopular with Chinese males, especially elite Chinese males. Indeed, it united the Ming subjects elsewhere against the Manchu. As a Jesuit missionary tartly observed, the Chinese are now grieving and fighting more valiantly for their hair than they had done for their emperor. So whereas the Manchu conquest of North China took 4 weeks, that of South China took 4 decades. Millions died in the civil war that followed. So that's how you change a crisis into a catastrophe. Crossing the road, crossing the street to pick a fight. So on to resilience, my final point. And now we advance from the 17th century in which I live to the 20th century in which I was born. Following a disastrous flood tide in the Thames in 1953, the British government asked its chief scientific officer, Herman Bondi, to assess whether another flood tide might perhaps inundate London. Now, Bondi was a mathematician, and he devoted a lot of attention to risk factors, to assessing risk. But he also was a very smart humanist, and he consulted historical sources. And to his surprise, he found that the height of storm tides recorded at London Bridge had increased by more than 3 feet since 1791, when records began. Now, Bondi couldn't explain why that had happened, but he predicted that it would continue and warned that if it did, and I quote from his report, a report that was classified until 2003, a major surge flood in London would be a disaster of the singular and immense kind. It would deliver a knockout blow to the nerve center of the country. End of quote. Bondi also considered other events which he described as low probability, high impact, such as an asteroid or a meteorite hitting central London. He said, yeah, the effects would be the same. It would be a catastrophe, but the risk was very low, and above all, prevention was almost impossible. Whereas another disastrous flood, similar to or worse than that of 1953, was inevitable. Bondi therefore unequivocally recommended the construction of a Thames barrier to make sure that there would never again be a surge tide. There's two. These are the different parts of it when they're down. There's raised. It's possible to raise a barrier all across between these large islands. This is what they look like. If you go to London and you take the ferry between, say, Tower Bridge and Greenwich, you go right through it. You go right through the barrier. It's very exciting. I thoroughly recommend it. So this is the barrier. It, for various reasons, mostly to do with money, it's not completed until 1982, almost 3 decades after the Great Flood, and at a stunning cost, 800 million. Those of you who are interested, this is the O2, which, as you see, is very close to the river. If there was another flood tide, the O2 would be gone, along with most of Canary Wharf and downtown London. So $800 million to build the Thames Barrier, but it now protects not only what Bondi called the nerve center of the country, but also property with a current value of $300 billion, including 40,000 commercial and industrial sites and more than 1 million residents. So far, since 1982, it's been activated more than 100 times, thus sparing London the fate of New Orleans in 2005 and of New York in 2012, in the face of natural disasters that were likewise inevitable. Now, the Great Flood of 1953 also affected the Netherlands and Belgium, leading to 13 major projects to protect those countries from another catastrophe, including the 8-mile Oosterschelde Kering, sometimes hailed as the eighth wonder of the world, completed in 1986, like the Thames Barrier more than 3 decades after the catastrophe, but designed to last for 200 years. Now, building projects like this against a future disaster is very expensive, but absolutely essential. It's rather like asparagus. If you want to eat decent asparagus now, you should have planted your asparagus bed a decade ago. And if you wanted to protect New Orleans from Katrina in 2005 and New York from Superstorm Sandy in 2012, you should have started to build those barriers no later than 1980. It's always cheaper to prepare than to repair. So let me conclude by proposing a model for resilience, the 1% doctrine, the title of a book by the journalist Ron Susskind, taken from former Vice President Cheney's reaction to the suggestion that a Pakistani scientist might offer nuclear weapons to Al-Qaeda. Cheney, pictured here in 2004, not with the gun that he used to shoot someone in the face, but a rather handsome flintlock musket, but presented by the NRA, Cheney observed that the US was obliged to confront such a low probability, high impact event because, and I quote, if there's a 1% chance that Pakistani scientists are helping Al-Qaeda build or develop nuclear weapons, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. It's not about our analysis, it's about our response. Now, I rarely agree with former Vice President Cheney, but these are wise words as we confront a far more probable high-impact event, namely climate change. If there's a 1% chance that global warming will destroy our planet, we are obliged to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. It's not about our analysis, it's about our response. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey and Adam. All right, so I think we're getting out of slideshow mode. Here we go. Wonderful. Well, I obviously want to thank both of you for those great talks and to start the conversation. First, let me say, if there's anybody in the audience who has a question, to please either raise your hand or put your question into chat, and myself or John Brooke will be happy to call it out. Let me start by asking you both a question, and I'd love to have this be as a conversation. As you both know, and perhaps some people on this Zoom call know, I'm a cultural historian, and so I spend a lot of time working with historical material and particularly thinking about language. And I've also become quite interested in environmental history and these questions of crisis and collapse. But what I'm still struggling with methodologically is how to connect culture to some of these, quite well documented environmental changes. And both of you sort of touched on that in ways that both interested me, but also, made me feel a little skeptical as a cultural historian. So, for example, the question of the hagiography and the response of hagiography, of course, are writings about saints. And to what extent does the hagiographic habit of one particular or two or three particular authors, how can we really know that is connected as a response to documented flooding, in this case, I believe, Adam, in a different part of Italy? And Geoffrey, I'm thinking about, I was struck when you were talking about the infanticide in Japan. And this, my point here is slightly different, but it's about culture. and about how infanticide becomes obviously part of the elite consciousness in the 17th century. And your argument is, as a result of the environmental crisis that everyone is going through. But I wonder whether infanticide had long been practiced by people who were not elite. And so then the question is, the cultural question is, well, crisis for whom? And when does infanticide become considered a catastrophe in Japanese culture? Is it only when the elite are forced to take it on, as opposed to when it's something more commonly done by non-elites? And then finally, just this whole question of culture and climate change today. I mean, living in a world where so many people deny climate change, where there is a whole kind of set of cultural predispositions which make people somehow incapable or uninterested or skeptical, you pick your word, of all of this quite convincing data from scientists, people who aren't going to change the way they behave regardless of the other information. I mean, doesn't all of this kind of suggest that culture maybe isn't an autonomous entity when it comes to crisis and environment, but doesn't necessarily, we can't just plug it in easily into one of these systems analyses that, I don't know, I mean, I guess back to Adam, where would you plug culture in when you're trying to understand, different levels of interaction, different types of impacts and outcomes? So yeah, that's would be my question. So I don't know, do you want to start, Adam?
Would Adam like to go first?
I can, yes, thank you. First, about the miracles in the 6th century Italy. So it's one author, actually, it's Gregory the Great, and his dialogues on the Italian saints, which is a collection of miracles. Half of it, or major chunk, about Saint Benedict, the rest about different guys from, mostly bishops from around Italy, and the miracles are actually miracles of these bishops. So the miracles actually come from the areas where there would be this increased precipitation, but these miracles, some of them are reported to have taken place much earlier, not in the late 6th century. It's really the late 6th century when our author, whoever it was, if it was Gregory the Great or somebody from his entourage, was writing. And of course, we don't know. I mean, he didn't write in the introduction, I'm seeing all these unusual events in the nature, and I thought I will collect miracles that have to do with that. We just see that compared to the entire corpus of miracle stories from late antiquity, and contemporaneous miracle stories from Gaul, so France basically, where they didn't have this kind of climatic extreme at the time, there is nothing similar. So that this text innovates in a way that can be connected, that apparently is related to the physical reality of increased winter rainfall and increased magnitude and frequency of floods. This is everything we know. So we can imagine how, I would say, we have some grounds to hypothesize on the intentions of this guy who authored that. So to refer to the real experience of the people, to bring them on board. We don't know who actually read that. Who read that? Yes, we don't know if these are miracle stories that circulated in sermons in churches, or actually, it was some copies in Rome and it only became famous 100 years or hundreds years later. It's very tricky in this respect. So this is a low-key argument in some way, but still quite remarkable. So this is what I would say in this case. And in terms of like culturists, I mean, I would say as a person who advocates for a systems or networks approach, nothing is autonomous. So everything is in some way connected. And it could be the straightforward way that you have, calamities and you act on them intellectually and culturally, and you start burning witches, But it could also be, as it is the case probably with Gregory, it's like experience something happening and you just start referring to that without like bad things, calamities actually happening.
So
I don't know if it
just,
answers the question.
yeah, no, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering, you know, if in fact these are catastrophic events, surely they would be registering them as catastrophic. I mean, I guess you're sort of laying two things together that may or may not work chronologically, and they work thematically, but
Chronologically, they do.
Right. But I guess again, and I mean, this is just a point, which is, you know, I guess ultimately what I'm trying to get at is, you know, how do you make sense of what Gregory thought a disaster was from this if he doesn't directly connect these miracles to some kind of broader series of floods, right? I mean, and it's, you know, they're very localized in the stories are very localized in the dialogues.
I mean, on the basis of the natural scientific data, we would expect this to actually be happening. So that there is actually, you know, increased rainfall in the winters, which should result in more flooding. So, and there is this guy who suddenly innovates in the way he writes about the saints. He refers to the sphere of reality, which is not really which was not really referred to previously. So this is very, I would say, this is of course some kind of co-occurrence, yes, because we have very limited evidence and we cannot trace these connections. We don't have, I mean, we have his letters, but not those in which he might be writing about that. So, I mean, it's a proposition. Yes, a way of like, the fact is that there is this innovation and there is this apparent physical reality that took place. And there is, I mean, if it doesn't have to be a disaster, it just needs to be something unusual happening, something impressive that you can make, you know, make a persuasive argument around it. And perhaps this connects us a little bit to the current situation when the public view on the climate change is changing because there are these catastrophes. I mean, we are doing it too late, probably. Yes, we should have done that in the 80s when there was nothing, you know, like nothing to build a persuasive argument around, but now we can. I mean, it's so obvious. Yes, everyone is kind of terrified for different reasons. And like, there is no month that you don't read in global media about some catastrophe related to climate change happening somewhere.
I'd like to resolve this issue so we can move on. I challenge the ancient historians to start thinking about a big data project. It's time to do this for this and the plagues. Do a big data project. A big data project on text.
A big data project, yeah.
Big data and you know, with the climate data, with all the, you know, the natural evidence and the human archive, and see when things appear. You know, let's have some data. We can't just have this endless anecdotal kind of references. You know, I think that personally, I think that there's a perfectly good working hypothesis that's been established. It ain't been proved yet, and that's only going to come when people make the move toward a fairly large project to do the kind of.
But this is what we did. We actually capitalized on two big data projects.
Yeah.
One on the Cult of Saints, another on latent climate.
Yeah.
But Michael McCormick put it a couple of years ago in his big project about the economy of early modern or early medieval Europe. The price of failure is so cheap. You know, if you have these big databases, you can interrogate the databases and come to some kind of a statistical conclusion.
Yeah, no, and I'd like
let's move on to a different topic here.
Well,
Geoffrey,
I think actually Geoffrey wants to chime in.
I want to get him in on this conversation or another conversation.
Well, Tina asked me you asked me a direct question, Tina, and I'd like to answer it, which is the connections between culture and catastrophe. I think I gave you a good example with the tonsorial castration I mean, there is absolutely no reason for the Manchu to insist on this and thereby to provoke a major confrontation with the Ming. It is their way of showing who's boss. But you asked me about infanticide, and that's a very interesting story because in Japan, I can't tell you when it stops, but I do remember seeing in a Japanese temple graveyard a number of small, rather sad wooden memorials saying, basically, I'm sorry I had you killed at birth, but we'll meet again in the next world. Please forgive me. So it's still a feature in the 19th century. I can't tell you when it dies out. I can tell you that it's very, very common in the 17th century because all the sources mention it. But there's nothing statistical in Japan. There is a very good one in China, a study of the Ming dynasty. And there we find, because they do these little genealogies, you find that there are 7 boys for every girl. Now, there is no way in nature that can happen. They are clearly murdering the girl children. So that supports the anecdotal sources which say that infanticide is very, very common. The contrast would be Europe, where in the 17th century, a number of governments, starting with Scotland and followed with England and France, declare infanticide to be a capital crime. The commonest offence for which women appear in court is infanticide. And they are, without question, without exception, they are hanged for killing their babies. If you want a book about it, there's a very good novel by Sir Walter Scott called The Heart of Midlothian, which is based around a poor girl called Effie Dean, who is accused of infanticide, and it's a question of how she proves that she didn't kill her baby. So it is very common. It becomes less common in England, in Europe. I don't think it becomes less common in China and Japan. But I would say that is a collision, if you like, between culture and catastrophe.
Okay, thank you, Geoffrey. Let me turn, we have a question now from the audience. One is from Dee Wang, and she wants to thank you both for the great talk and the earlier seminar, and asks if you could both elaborate a little more on how historians and scientists deal with biases and ambiguities in environmental data and written sources, such as emphasizing extreme weather and using the same adjectives for things of different scales, which is a great question, I think, because again, it comes back to my earlier point about language and how do you navigate the language of your sources, particularly, if I can just build on that, in a pre-modern era, an early modern era, where you have limited instruments for measuring environmental developments. So let's, Geoffrey, do you want to start this time, and then Adam, go to you?
Yeah, I can only say the way that I started, which was looking first at the human archives, the written sources, because that's where I feel more proficient, and then trying to see whether they matched up with the scientific data, the databases, particularly those put out by NOAA, N-O-A-A. And for example, I found Milton, that little ray of sunshine, starts writing Paradise Lost in 1658, in which he describes in his own chilling phrase the universe of death that surrounds him. And when you look at the NOAA documents, 1658 is indeed one of the coldest winters on record in the 17th century. He really is living at a time of climatic extremes. So I started with the written sources, and then I looked at the scientific data.
Adam, do you want to chime in?
Yes. So probably I would differentiate between environmental and written sources, which are kind of, it is about environmental phenomena in the written sources. Okay, so we are really talking about the written sources. So it's, there are two sides of the problem. One is that we have quantitative data on the environmental side. So as Geoffrey, for instance, gave this example, we might know that this was an extreme winter. This was we have a quantitative scale on which we can compare things. But on the other hand, it is also the question of looking, it's not just that there is a linear relationship between how extreme in quantitative terms as seen in the environmental data and paleoclimate data an event is or a period of time is, but it's also the question of how this is, let's say, integrated, how this feeds into the moment at which society finds itself. And it could be that there is some more extreme conditions that come at the moment when the society is able to buffer that, to adapt, to basically go for it. And there might be some situation when the magnitude is actually lower, and we see from the written data that the problem is much bigger. So I think that what we should consider here is this interaction really between the societal and the natural in this case. Also, there is another aspect that we have the natural scientific data that are quantifiable, they are quantitative, but there are different uncertainties in them. And the magnitude of the effect in some of these proxies could not be a direct, also linearly, in a linear way related to the actual phenomenon, because there are other phenomena coming together in the, let's say, in the production, in the formation of the proxy. So of a speleothem, which we study for some chemical changes over time and so on. These chemical changes can be related not only to our main phenomenon, but they can be amplified by some other covariables.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yes,
okay.
we have one from Henry Misa.
Henry.
Sorry.
Henry, do you want to pop out and ask your question? Nope. Okay, go ahead.
Do you want me to read, John, or do you want to?
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, here he is. Henry. Hi, speak up.
Okay, thank you very much for the lectures. Particularly fascinated in the network approaches. And my question is, how does or doesn't the study of pre-industrial climate and environmental history influence our understanding of the Anthropocene crisis, a crisis that has implications for Cenozoic, so geological timescales, or maybe even Phanerozoic timescales, so even larger geological timescales?
I would say it's a massive question and not really easy to answer, in the sense that we are moving into a complete unknown, as you notice in your question. Yes, like the 17th century or any late Holocene societies didn't witness what we are witnessing right now in terms of changes that are happening in the Earth system and will happen. So this also limits the possibilities of learning from history, in my eyes. But on the other hand, it is interesting to look at something that many call the proto-Anthropocene. So how the situation in which we are finding ourselves at the moment, how much it was kind of prepared earlier, how much there is an earlier dynamics that some would say just achieved a different scale through technology and led us into Anthropocene. These are, like the ways in which I try to tackle that. I'm also asking myself this question, and it's difficult to answer it.
I'd like to make a comment on that, which is just to say that the natural archive is fundamentally important, because we as historians are focused on what we can see in the written archives, but the human experience and the global experience, the planetary experience, is much, much longer. And we need to be able to compare reasonably accurately. And if we only look at the human archive, we cannot see the history of the Earth. We can't talk about the Cenozoic. We cannot talk about the Phanerozoic. We have to, and yesterday I was in a meeting from the SETI Institute, and I was the only historian in the group. And they were operating on completely different timescales. And so, we just have to, we have to think about who we're in conversation with. Sometimes the historical framework makes sense. Sometimes we have to be able to talk in different ways, and that's where we have to be. Have to understand that natural world. Adam, go ahead.
I just want to comment on a comment that I can see on the chat from Chris Otter, that there are historians, scholars who argue that the early modern period is the time when the Anthropocene really begins. And I think what is at stake is what consequences then you take from the different starting points of the Anthropocene. If you say this is the great acceleration of the 1950s and the huge increase, exponential increase in the consumption of the fossil fuels, this is where you identify the problem as technological. Or perhaps when you think about the British Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the production and consumption of coal, when you look at the entire early modern period, I would say as an ancient historian, you should also look at Greek antiquity, where you have similar mechanisms of market integration, of capital accumulation, and so on. And then you come to the question about the nature of, in the end, you come to the question of the nature of human societies, and that the change that is needed to avoid Anthropocene, the catastrophe in the longer term, is not just replacing coal with solar power and wind power, but actually changing our way we live, our consumption patterns, like something much more profound, perhaps. So this extending of the time period, I think it brings a lot of important moral questions with it.
Did you want to say something?
I did. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the work, Jeff and Adam, that you guys are doing. I think it's path breaking. And I think the fact that we're sitting here having historiographical arguments about how you use science properly to tell these stories correctly speaks to the sort of larger message of what's underway here, which is I think it's probably professionally irresponsible to do human history without considering the enormous scientific record that is now out there to help us understand further. How we do that is what we're arguing about, and I think that's critical and important. But that larger body of science, I think we all have to remember, and John Burke pointed this out in his book, Rough Journey, this is a recent phenomenon. This is a synthesis that didn't exist when I was a graduate student and was coming together then and is growing at light speeds. It's changing every 5 years. And it's a body of knowledge that is as brand new, might be a key to the question of, well, how does this also help us deal with what Geoffrey's plea at the end of his presentation, and I'm sure you give it off, and we need to respond to this. We need to respond to this. And I think there's a sense today that we're not responding to it, right? And I think that sense is derived from the early environmental movement, whose holy grail was policy and leaders making high-level decisions. And that's remained our holy grail. But my own experience as a professional is when I graduated with my PhD in 2001, I first went into the nonprofit because there was a climate crisis on our hands and we needed to get higher education to pay attention to it. And we did workshops, we worked with all levels of the university, and it was news to them. This was not what engineers were doing. This was not what scientists were doing. This was news to them. Today, I stand in a university where there's not a single serious scholar who's not taking this seriously. And you look around the globe and there's not a place where serious people are not taking this seriously, who are not treating it like it's real. I think that phenomena is something we lose sight of. And I agree with you, Adam, about the actor network systems approach to this. We have to do that, but it means nothing's autonomous. And it means if our holy grail is a holy grail of government officials coming together and agreeing to something that we think our models tell us is going to be an outcome, and that fails, we misunderstand how far we have come in 20 years, and we may be looking in the wrong places. The inflection point might be upon us. So that's my comment.
That's almost a great last word, but I want to give the last word to Geoffrey. Would you like to close us out? We are 10 minutes over time, but I thought maybe you should have an opportunity to make a final comment.
No, I wouldn't, John. Thank you. Adam, it's 9 o'clock where we're 9:15 where he is. He's been
Okay, all right. Well, then on that note, it is 10 after 3 and it is 10 after 9. So let us call it a day and thank Adam Izdebski and Geoffrey Parker for their presentations
Thank
today,
you.
and Tina for launching us on this this seminar. And with that, have a great afternoon and evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.